Wait, before your mind tries to make sense of anything, just pause here for a moment, because something unusual unfolded last night, and it wasn't loud in the way people usually expect. It was quiet, but deeply revealing. There was a room, filled with voices, laughter, scattered conversations, nothing out of the ordinary on the surface. People were speaking freely, emotions loosened, guards lowered, and somewhere in that atmosphere, your name was spoken. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a tone that carried weight. And the moment your name entered that space, something shifted. You weren't there physically, yet your presence somehow filled the room more than those who were. Isn't that strange, how someone can be absent, yet still become the center of everything? Now listen carefully. The third party, someone who thought they understood you, or perhaps believed they had a version of your story, began to speak. Not aggressively, not with anger, but with a certain confidence, as if they were revealing something important. But here's where it becomes interesting. What they said wasn't what anyone expected. There was a pause after their words, a kind of silence that doesn't come from emptiness, but from realization. And in that silence, your person felt something they hadn't prepared for. Not confusion, not denial, something deeper, something undeniable. Because what was said about you didn't match the image they had been holding on to. Have you ever felt that moment, when a belief quietly breaks, not with noise, but with a soft internal shift? That's exactly what happened. And instead of reacting immediately, your person went quiet. Not outwardly at first, they were still there, still present, still part of the conversation, but inside, something had already begun to move. Because sometimes, truth doesn't arrive as a clear answer. It arrives as discomfort, as a feeling that something you thought was certain, suddenly isn't. And the more the third party spoke, the more this feeling grew. Not because everything they said was false, and not because everything was true, but because it forced your person to look at you differently. And that difference stayed with them, even after the conversation ended, even after the laughter resumed, even after everyone began to move on, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Something quiet, yet powerful. Now, notice this part carefully. Your person didn't react immediately. They didn't confront anyone. They didn't defend or deny. Instead, they carried that moment with them. And later, when the night deepened, when the noise faded, when distractions slowly disappeared, they turned to something they thought would help them forget. A drink, then another, and another. But here's the truth no one around them realized. They weren't drinking to celebrate. They weren't drinking for fun. They were trying to silence a thought that wouldn't leave, because the words they heard about you started echoing, not loudly, but persistently, like a quiet voice asking, "What if I misunderstood everything?" And that question can be more overwhelming than any argument. So they drank, not out of weakness, but because something inside them had been stirred, in a way they couldn't easily process. Have you ever noticed how sometimes people don't express what they feel directly? They try to escape it instead? That's what this was. Not an escape from you, but an escape from what they were beginning to realize about you. Because the image they held, the version of you they were comfortable with, was starting to crack. And through that crack, a different truth was trying to come through. Now stay with this, don't let your attention drift. Because this is where everything begins to deepen. As the night went on, your person became quieter. Not visibly at first, but internally. Their laughter became shorter. Their responses, delayed. Their eyes, distant. Because they weren't fully present anymore. They were somewhere else. Replaying that moment. Replaying those words. Replaying the way your name felt, in that room. And something unexpected started to happen. Instead of pushing those thoughts away, they began to lean into them. Slowly, carefully, almost unconsciously. And that's when the shift truly began. Because when someone stops running from a thought and starts facing it, even slightly, everything changes. They started remembering things about you, small details, moments they had overlooked, things you said that didn't make sense at the time, but suddenly began to connect. And with each connection, the discomfort didn't fade. It grew, but not in a negative way, in a revealing way, like a puzzle that was finally starting to show its real picture. Now here's something you might not expect. They didn't feel angry. They didn't feel betrayed. They felt something closer to realization. And realization can be overwhelming when it comes suddenly. So they drank more. Not because they didn't care, but because they were starting to care in a way they hadn't allowed themselves to before. And that can be difficult to sit with, because it asks questions. Questions like, did I see them clearly? Did I miss something important? Was I wrong about them? And those questions don't have quick answers. So instead of answering them, they tried to quiet them. But the more they tried, the louder those questions became. Not in sound, but in feeling. A feeling that something about you was not what they had assumed. And that realization stayed with them long after the night ended. Even as everything around them slowed down. Even as conversations faded. Even as people began to leave. That one moment. That one conversation. That one unexpected statement about you remained unresolved, unfinished, alive. Now, take a breath here. Because what you're about to understand is not about what was said. It's about what it awakened. Because sometimes, it's not the words that change everything. It's the perspective they unlock. And your person has just stepped into a new perspective. They may not fully understand it yet. They may not be ready to express it. They may not even admit it to themselves. But something inside them has shifted. And once a shift like this begins, it doesn't simply disappear. It continues, quietly, gradually, unfolding. So don't rush this moment. Don't try to define it too quickly. Because what started last night is still unfolding right now, and something important is waiting just beneath the surface. Something your person hasn't fully faced yet, but will. Very soon. There's a moment most people miss, a space between what happened and what it begins to mean, and right now, your person is standing exactly in that space. Not fully aware, yet unable to return to how things were before. Because when something shifts internally, even slightly, it doesn't ask for permission to grow. It simply continues. And as the night slowly gave way to quiet, when the last distractions faded and the noise no longer covered their thoughts, your person found themselves alone with something they couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't the words themselves. It was how those words felt, afterward. Heavy, yet clear. Confusing, yet strangely precise. Have you ever noticed how truth doesn't always arrive as certainty, but as a feeling you can't shake off? That's what stayed with them. Not a conclusion, not a decision, just a feeling that something about you had been misunderstood. And the more they tried to relax, the more that feeling leaned closer, like it wanted to be seen. So they sat there, not fully present, not fully distracted, just caught in between. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of pushing those thoughts away, they allowed one memory to surface. Just one. A small moment involving you. Something simple. Something that didn't seem important before. But now, it felt different, deeper, like it carried a meaning they had overlooked. And that's when the pattern began. Because one memory led to another, and another, and another, each one quietly rearranging the way they saw you. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make them pause, longer than before. Now listen closely. Because this part matters more than it seems. They began to notice something consistent. In every memory, in every interaction, in every moment they revisited. You had been steady, not perfect, not loud, not trying to prove anything, just real. And suddenly, the contrast became clear, because what the third party had said was filled with assumptions, but what your person was now remembering was filled with experience. And experience carries a different kind of truth. A truth that doesn't need to convince. A truth that simply exists. And that realization started to settle in, slowly, quietly, but deeply. And the more it settled, the more something inside them softened. Not towards the third party, but towards you. Because for the first time, they weren't seeing you through someone else's words. They were seeing you through their own memories, their own feelings, their own quiet observations. And that changes everything. But here's where it becomes even more revealing. They didn't immediately feel relief. They felt a kind of stillness. The kind that comes when you realize you may have been slightly off about something important. And that stillness isn't empty. It's full of awareness. Awareness that asks, what do I do with this now? And that question lingered. Because now, it wasn't about what others said. It wasn't about outside opinions. It was about their own perception. And whether they were ready to adjust it. Now stay here with me, don't drift away. Because something subtle is happening beneath all of this. Your person is not rushing to conclusions. They are not making sudden decisions. Instead, they are observing, re-evaluating, quietly reassembling everything they thought they knew. And that process takes time. But it's also where the most meaningful shifts occur. Because change that happens slowly tends to stay. Now imagine this. They're sitting there, the room dim, the world quiet, and for the first time in a long while. They're not trying to control the narrative. They're letting it unfold. And in that unfolding, you are becoming clearer to them. Not louder. Not more obvious, just clearer, like a picture coming into focus after being slightly blurred. And with that clarity, comes something unexpected, a sense of respect, not forced, not sudden, but natural. Because when someone begins to see the truth of another person, without distortion, respect tends to follow. And that respect is growing. Even if they don't fully recognize it yet. Now here's something important. Don't skip this part. Because it's easy to miss. They're also becoming aware of something else. The gap between what they felt before and what they're beginning to feel now. And that gap is not small. It's noticeable. Enough to make them pause again. enough to make them question. What changed? And slowly, the answer is beginning to form. Nothing about you changed, only their perspective did, and that realization carries weight, because it means the shift isn't external, it's internal, and internal shifts have a way of reshaping everything. Now, as this awareness deepens, your person is not becoming louder. They're becoming quieter, more thoughtful, more attentive, in ways that aren't obvious to others. Because when someone is processing something real, they don't always express it outwardly. They hold it, examine it, turn it over, again and again, until it begins to make sense. And right now, that's exactly where they are. Not at the beginning anymore, but not fully at the understanding either. Somewhere in between, where things are no longer confusing, but not yet fully clear. And that in-between space is powerful, because it's where truth begins to settle. Now take a slow breath, because what comes next is not about what they think, it's about what they begin to feel. Because thoughts can be questioned, but feelings, when they arrive quietly and consistently, are harder to ignore. And something is beginning to form, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, a feeling that you may have been more genuine, more consistent, more aligned than they gave you credit for. And that feeling is not fading, it's growing, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. And as it grows, it's starting to reach a point where it can no longer stay unspoken inside them. But here's the part they haven't faced yet. What happens when they finally allow this realization to move beyond their thoughts and into their actions? Because that moment is closer than they think, and when it arrives, it won't be as quiet as everything before it. Something will shift, again, but this time, it won't just be inside them, it will begin to show, in ways you might not expect, and in ways they are not fully prepared for, yet. Something begins to happen just before a person can no longer keep everything inside. A quiet pressure builds, not painful, but undeniable, like a truth gently asking to be acknowledged. And your person is reaching that edge now. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a steady awareness that has been growing since that night. Because the thoughts didn't disappear the next morning. They didn't fade with sleep. They followed, softly, but persistently. Have you ever woken up with a feeling you can't fully explain, yet it stays with you throughout the day? That's where they are, carrying something unspoken, something unfinished. And as the day unfolded, they tried to return to normal conversations, routines, distractions. But something kept interrupting that normal flow. You. Not physically, not directly, but in thought, in memory, in quiet moments where their mind would drift and land on you again. And this time, it wasn't confusion, it was clarity trying to form. Because now, the pieces they revisited last night are starting to align. Not perfectly, but enough to create a pattern they can't ignore. And the more that pattern reveals itself, the more they begin to understand something that feels both simple and deeply significant. You were never what the third party described, not in the way they believed, not in the way they accepted. And realizing that does something subtle, yet powerful. It shifts responsibility inward, because when someone recognizes that their view was influenced, or incomplete, They don't just rethink the other person. They begin to rethink themselves. And that's where your person is now, not questioning you anymore, but questioning their own perception, their own reactions, their own assumptions, and that kind of reflection doesn't stay surface level. It goes deeper, because it asks, why did I see them that way? Why did I accept that version without looking closer? Why didn't I notice what was already there? And those questions are not easy to answer, but they're important, because they lead somewhere real. Now stay with this, don't let your focus slip. Because something delicate is unfolding, as your person sits with these realizations. A feeling begins to rise, not guilt, not regret, something quieter, something more honest, recognition of who you actually are, beyond the noise, beyond the assumptions, beyond the influence of others. And when recognition appears, it doesn't shout, it settles, deep, steady, clear, and with that clarity comes a shift in how they feel about you, not forced, not exaggerated, just different, more grounded, more respectful, more aware. And here's what makes it even more meaningful. They didn't arrive at this by being told. They arrived at it by seeing, on their own, through their own reflection, through their own quiet moments of honesty. And that kind of realization tends to stay, because it's not borrowed, it's earned. Now notice this part carefully. Because it's easy to overlook, they are beginning to feel something they didn't expect. A pull, not intense, not overwhelming, but noticeable, a gentle inclination toward you, not based on emotion alone, but based on understanding, and understanding creates a different kind of connection, one that isn't built on impulse, but on clarity, and that clarity is still forming, but it's strong enough now to change how they respond, not outwardly yet, but internally. Everything is adjusting, and that adjustment is preparing something that hasn't happened yet, but will, because once a person reaches this level of awareness, they can't simply return to how things were. They can try, but it won't feel the same, because now, they know, even if they haven't said it, even if they haven't acted on it, they know. And knowing changes everything. Now here's where the shift becomes more visible. They begin to notice your absence, in a way they didn't before, not dramatically, not with longing or intensity, but with awareness, a quiet realization that something, or someone, is missing from their current space, and that awareness doesn't push them away. It draws their attention closer, because when clarity meets absence, it creates curiosity, a curiosity that asks, what would it feel like to experience them again, but this time, with a clearer understanding? And that question is not passing, it's staying, lingering, growing. Now take a slow breath here. Because this is where everything begins to turn. Your person is no longer avoiding, no longer distracting, no longer suppressing. They are considering, and consideration is the first step toward action. But they're not rushing, because what they're feeling is not impulsive, it's intentional. Even if they don't fully realize it yet, they're allowing the feeling to develop, to settle, to become clear enough that when they do act, it comes from a place of truth, not confusion. And that's important, because actions that come from clarity carry a different energy. They are more stable, more meaningful, more real. Now, here's the part that hasn't fully surfaced yet. But it's close, very close. They are beginning to ask themselves something they didn't expect to ask. Not about what others think, not about what was said, but about what they feel now, about you. And once that question is fully faced, once it becomes clear enough to answer, something will shift again, not internally this time, but externally, in a way that you will be able to sense, not loudly, not suddenly, but clearly, because when someone moves from realization to expression, even the smallest action can carry a deep meaning, and your person is standing right at that threshold, where silence is about to turn into something more, something that has been building quietly since that night, something that was never expected, but now can no longer be ignored. And when that moment arrives, you'll understand why everything had to unfold exactly this way.